Hello fellow cinephiles, 90s Film Guru here. Thanks for joining me today. So like the video says, I'm going to start to look at trying to break down certain movies that I really enjoyed, sort of talk about what the film is trying to say, or what I drew from it, or what I thought of the movie, and look at particular scenes that sort of convey that. So today I thought I'd start with a film I really liked, a film that I've gone back to many times, and I know it is 2000, so it does fall a little over my 90s thing, but like I said, I'm starting from 1989 to 2000, so it sort of still fits within what I'm trying to talk about on this particular channel. Like the video says, I'm going to start with Unbreakable. I think this is one of M. Night's best films, maybe his best movie. It's just really wonderful. It's such an original, unique concept for a superhero film, and it sort of was the beginning before X-Men in a lot of ways of doing these sort of superhero movies right. Now originally M. Night wanted to release this as a superhero movie, but they wouldn't allow him to call it that, so they called it a thriller because his previous film The Sixth Sense was a thriller, and they thought that would be the best way to draw people in because they weren't really into the comic book genre as movies at this stage. And I think that's part of why the film suffered a little bit. It was successful and did well, and it allowed M. Night to go on to make other films. Of course it did, but it just didn't have the impact I think it could have and should have for its sort of genre. It's something that was originally conceived as a trilogy, but he only got to make the first one, and because that was frowned upon a little bit, he wasn't able to make the other two films until much later. But with Split, that character in it, the Horde, was originally meant to be in Unbreakable, but he felt there was too much in that he wanted to keep it as a simple origin story between David Dunn and Mr. Glass. So he sort of ultimately didn't put that character in, but ultimately did what he wanted to do with that. And then obviously we got Glass, which was the concluding chapter to this trilogy, which was really great. And it continued to evolve and grow and shape this into a really fascinating superhero trilogy. This and X-Men came out at the same time, but if you look at both of these films, they were sort of not as accepted as they could have been. Like Unbreakable, like I said, was sort of hushed and put in the corner to say it was a thriller, not a superhero movie. And even when X-Men came out, they all dressed them in black because they were fearful of people thinking they're silly or stupid, and then they're still scared of taking risks with these particular characters. And obviously once we got into Spider-Man, that sort of changed everything and ultimately led to DC and Marvel and all the other films that followed. But this is really the beginning of it all, in my opinion, and definitely a superhero movie that should be considered a superhero movie, not just a thriller. The film came out in 2000. It was made for 75 million, went on to make 248 million. So it was reasonably successful for M. Night and for the studio as well. And it did pretty well. There was a lot of positive reviews that sort of praised M. Night for his directing, the writing, the acting, and just the way that the film was sort of done. And it celebrates him in such a great way. And it was such a fascinating second film for him to do, ultimately, because his first film was kind of this simple sort of film. This is kind of that as well, but it's the evolution of that. And I feel this was one of the examples of when a filmmaker makes a second movie that's better than the first, and I think this is the example of that. And they call this, and I agree with it, the most grounded film within the subgenre of the superhero movies. It is very grounded and very real. The abilities that David Dunn has, strength and his intuitiveness, where he can touch someone and see something they've done, it's really cool, which makes it kind of a simple film. And then you've got Mr. Glass, who's the villain, and he ultimately is a great interpretation of the really smart villain, the villain that doesn't have to do much to ultimately become the supervillain. He uses his mind rather than his brawn, and I kind of like that. And M. Night followed the three-act structure of the comic book sort of origin story and did that with his film. And he also worked with the cinematographer, coming up with particular shots that resembled the panels on a comic book, and chose particular scenes to emphasize certain things. And I think that's a very smart way to go about it. Ultimately, the film follows David Dunn, played by Bruce Willis. He's a security guard who survives a train crash. He begins to question things as why he is the sole survivor. He meets Elijah, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who seems to have the answers he wants. With Elijah's help, he starts to slowly realize he has a special ability that he's able to benefit others. This is his journey. This is his journey to become a superhero. And that's ultimately what it is. It's a great origin story. So I want to go through and break down particular scenes. I'm going to go through every scene, or most of the scenes in the film, and just talk about a little bit about what I think they were trying to do and talk about what the scene itself encompassed. So the film opens up when we meet Elijah's mother. She's just given birth and she's hanging on to Elijah and he's crying. This is when a doctor who just happens to be in the store at the time, and this is set during the 60s, I'm pretty sure, and he comes to investigate why the kid is crying. All of this is shot, and then we ultimately find out that Elijah's arms and legs are broken. And that's the beginning of the pain and anguish that he has at the beginning of his life that ultimately leads through to the rest of it. And all of this is shot through a mirror, and it shows reflections, and there are scenes where it's away from that, but mostly it's shot through the mirror. And this is a theme that someone pointed out that I didn't really think about, but every time we see Elijah, Mr. Glass, it's through there's some sort of glass aspect to this particular scene. So in this scene, it's through the mirror. And the way it's shot and the way it's captured is very simple. Like a lot of shots in this film is because it's capturing that panel from comic book movies. And it's just really well done, but it does emphasize this idea of the pain that Elijah will go through, and also that he's not normal in what has happened to him. And that this is the beginning of where the glass takes a big important part in revealing certain aspects to his character, but also to convey that this is the character that we'll be watching, that he's brittle, he can be broken like glass. The next scene after that is ultimately where we meet David Dunn, Bruce Willis's character. And the way this sequence is done is really great. It's on a train, but it's sort of shot between two seats, and it's like someone watching him, you know, and the camera moves from side to side, so we see through the middle, we see what he's looking at and what he's doing, and when he goes over to the window, the camera slides over there as well. And so it's sort of this unique way it's being shot, and like a comic book panel, it shows it's shot in a particular style, which I really like. It sets up many things about Dunn himself, that he's gone to some interview, he's coming back to Philadelphia, a young woman sits next to him, and he sort of quickly takes his wedding ring off, and at first glance it might look like, oh, he's a bit of a sleazy character, but I think what it's saying is it's sort of setting up this idea that he's married, but it isn't a great marriage, or it isn't working, or they're separated, or whatever it may be. And he just feels like he's trying to move on, but it's too quick, and he takes the ring off and he embarrasses himself and ultimately puts it back on. It sort of sets up the struggle that he's going through as a person, but also the relationships that he's having. And it sort of sets the character in a good way, I think, in a way, and then obviously the crash. But what I sort of drew from it is it's shot between two seats, and there's two seats in front of him. So it's like there's a barrier between him and us, or us and him. And it's sort of keeping him at a distance from us. We're just observing him at the moment. We're not part of the story. We aren't connected to this character, and we aren't going on the journey with them just yet. It's just keeping us at a distance. And I think that's kind of how the character feels, maybe a little bit. That he keeps people at a distance because he's unhappy or struggling or whatever it is. Even his wife he's keeping at a distance, and his son. And that's sort of represented in this sort of barrier that's created here. But this scene is really cool because it sets up for two reasons. One, it sets up his character, but also it shows that the way the train speeds up and the accident that's going to unfold, that we don't see, and we only see the aftermath of it, but it sort of fades to white, and I really like that. And this is something that they go back to, this crash in particular, when we get to Split. Now when we get to Glass, and they sort of talk about the Horde's backstory, and we ultimately find out that his father was on that particular train and died. And it's a great sort of connection there, that we could have had a scene with that if they had seen that what was going to transpire for this film and what M. Night would do much later in his life. It's just really well done and put together, and it sort of draws you in slowly. After the accident, we cut to Dunn's son, and he's seeing this crash on the news, and he realizes that his father was part of it, and ultimately they end up going to the hospital. And this is where he wakens in a bed, and he's in the hospital, and in front of him is this person slowly dying, and then this similar shot that we saw in the previous scene where it's shot between two curtains and we see him. So there's still a barrier between him and us. Like, we're not allowed in just yet. We're just keeping it at a distance so we can observe what's happening rather than become part of it. This is the scene where it's explained to him that there was a big train crash and so many people died, and he's the sole survivor. And the other gentleman that we see in the foreground is ultimately the last survivor who's slowly dying. He starts to ask these questions. The doctor's confused. He's confused. He's not quite sure what's transpired or how he was able to survive the crash. Either is the doctor. But like I said, it's still a barrier, and it sort of introduces this idea that maybe he is special in some form, or that he's able to survive things in different ways. Or was it just a simple miracle that he survived? And that's what the film slowly starts to get the audience to do, ask questions. From this scene, we're led to the hospital. He steps out into the corridor. Now, this is the first time we've really been sort of part of his story. We don't quite hear anything. There's this silence and muffled voices as he's walking through this sort of sea of people. All these people are waiting to hear what happened to their loved ones. And it's kind of like he's confused, but everyone else is confused, and they don't know what to make of it. How could he survive and their loved ones not? And what is it about this guy that allowed him to survive this horrific crash? They're all more amazed that he hasn't got a scratch on him. It's kind of a powerful scene. It's like, I don't know, parting of the Red Sea in a way, or, you know, this sort of invincible or spiritual guy who survived this, and they don't know why. Really don't know what to make of it or how to take it, and it's kind of powerful in a way. This is where we're reintroduced to his son and his wife, Audrey, played by Robin Wright Penn. And you can see there's still a issue between them, and that sort of returns back to that the first time we met Dunn, where he takes the wedding ring off, and the impact of that and how they're struggling. And you can see in this scene that continues on that theme, in that Audrey's glad he's alive, but she's very hesitant to hug him, but she does anyway, and it's this awkward exchange. And only the son puts their hands together to hold hands, and they hold for a little bit and then drop them. So you can really tell there's a divide between these two, that things aren't going well, that Dunn isn't quite happy and Audrey isn't quite happy within the marriage itself, and there's conflict there. And that can be part of both, but it sort of only comes down to his feeling like he doesn't fit in, he doesn't know where he fits in. And like he mentions in the film, after the crash, and when he went to sleep, it was the first time he wasn't filled with sadness. Like that awakened something in him, and that awakened these abilities in some form that he's always had, but he just didn't realise at the time. And they go into more detail in regards to that, with a particular car accident he had that he survived, that he talked about getting injured, but it wasn't quite what it seemed. And we learn more about that when he gets home, and ultimately we see that they're sleeping in separate rooms, that he went to this job interview because he's thinking of moving from their home, and just how the son's sort of struggling to make sense of that and always wants to sleep with his father. So it's all setting up this really interesting story and these really interesting characters, and a man that's questioning things which a lot of people can connect to and be drawn into, because we all ask that question. What are we here for? What's the point of life? And where do we fit in? And this kind of sort of tries to address that in a unique. From there, we're led into the funeral scene for all the people who died on the train. There's a priest talking about who these people are, and the loss that a lot of people are facing because of the deaths of these people. There is a deleted scene that they talk about where Dunn's talking to a priest, and he just starts to talk about, do you think it's a miracle and stuff like that, and the priest isn't like, no, I just think these things happen. And it's kind of an interesting scene that was cut. It would have been interesting in the film, but I just feel like this film is just done in a way that is tight in its execution, and it lets things unfold in a simple way rather than having characters go on to big monologues. Yes, Elijah does have some monologues within the film, especially when we meet him in his art gallery, but it's just different. With superhero movies, you usually have someone explain everything, where this one sort of was like, no, we're just going to show this film. you start to pick from and put it together as you go along. So in a way, I'm glad that scene was taken out. After the funeral, he finds a note under his windshield that has the name Limited Edition, which is Elijah's art gallery. And the note inside asks, how many days in your life have you been sick? What I think is really fascinating about this simple letter thing is, in most times in films like this, you have the guy with the card looking around. Who the hell put this in? What's this got to do with anything? And he'd probably just throw it away and not give it another thought. But because of the place that David Dunn is in, where he's starting to question things, where he's starting to wonder why he survived and no one else did, he feels that this might hold the answers, and he starts to follow along. He goes to work. We find out he's a security guard, so he's already doing protection in some form. And then he starts to ask his boss the question, how many days have been sick? And then he asks Audrey how many days have been sick, and no one can remember any time he's ever been sick. So it's like, because he has these questions, he follows what Elijah is asking him no matter what, and he investigates himself. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't think he's crazy, well, to begin with anyway. He just thinks, this person has the answers I want, I'm going to follow along. And that's what happens, and the film continues like that. And I think that's really fascinating. There's a little scene too when he's being security at work, and and there's a football team, I guess the college football team or whatever team he's sort of part of the security for. He's playing a game and it's raining. He's in his sort of slicker, which will become his sort of signature outfit for the character in the film. And it sort of says a couple of things in regard. One, it shows that there's a sadness in him about watching the football. So maybe he was a football player at some point. The lady on the train told him that she was a scout for, an agent for football players, and he said, I don't like football. But this scene says otherwise. It says so much about what's going on. It says so much about maybe his past or what's happening. And I think on first viewing, you don't take any really notice of this scene. But as you watch this film more and more, you start to realise that each scene serves some sort of purpose in a way. Well, that's the hope anyway, and that's what I'm trying to draw from. And this scene says some small amount of maybe his history, but it also is an anchoring point that we return to at the end of the film. When he's ultimately knows what his abilities are, he finds this bad guy, he starts to follow him, it's raining, he's in the slicker, so it's sort of returning back to that scene, and it sort of bookends both of those scenes, and I think that's really cool. So we begin with Elijah at the start of the film, and then it's really about Dunn. And then we skip back to Elijah. In 1974, he's a teenager. He's in his house. He's broken his arm once again. And he's sitting in front of the TV. And his mother comes in and starts to tell him he's got to get outside, ultimately, that he can't stay in here forever. And he talks about the fearfulness that he has of going outside. They call him Mr. Glass. That's where this term comes from. That's where this name comes from, calling him that to begin with. And he's just fearful of going outside and getting hurt again. And his mum ultimately comes up a way of doing it by putting a comic book outside on a chair in the playground, wrapped in a purple box, which is a theme and a colour that will be used for Mr. Glass throughout the movie. And it sort of sums up that, even though he's fearful, his mother's trying to help him. And this is where his love and growing understanding of comics and comic book stories starts to take hold, which will influence and transform his life as he goes along, as he gets older. What I like about this scene, once again, there's references to Glass. When we see him talking with his mother, he's staring at a TV, an old box TV. The TV's not on, so we're just seeing the reflection. The whole scene is shot through this reflection of him talking to his mother. Then ultimately, when she talks about that there's a comic book outside, he goes to the window. So once again, we're looking through glass, and this is part of this glass. So it's not by accident. Obviously, M. Night wanted to do that, but it's just really wonderfully shot, and it says a lot about the beginnings of his character. And I think these scenes are really cool in their small amount and what they're saying, in that he may be fearful, but there might be something for him outside. There might be something that he can pursue that'll get him out of where he feels most restrained and stuck and fearful. And Dunn, filled with all these questions and these answers that he got with this particular question, he goes to see Elijah at the art gallery. And once again, we see Elijah and we meet him, and we see him through a pane of glass. His whole gallery is glass. His walking stick is glass. There's just glass all around, which is such a representation of the character, and it's cemented in that. I like that. In this scene is where Elijah starts to talk about comic books. He starts to talk about the heroes and the villains, and because David Dunn survived this crash, he starts to ask him other questions, trying to work out if he is this particular person. He's got ulterior motives as he's searching for someone like him to make sense of who he is and help him find out who he is as a person. And he starts to talk about how comic book stories are sort of about myths, and he talks about how it's the last storytelling in a way, because it was used to be drawing things on walls and stuff like that. So there's all of these sort of connections for him and to comic books, but also emphasizing particular aspects of things we'll learn and see throughout the film regards to that particular form of creative expression. And Elijah says to Dunn, like, you know, like, you've never been hurt, right? And this is where his son pipes up and says, yes, he has. He was in a car accident when he was a kid, when he was younger, and he got hurt. Dunn is hesitant to talk about it because he knows that really the truth, and we'll find that out later, but he says, yes, I have been hurt before. Elijah starts to try to make sense of thing, and he goes through this thing, and then Dunn just really sees him as, feels he's some sort of crazy man. And his first initial feelings of this character are definitely true, and definitely something we see later. And it's like, he still has these questions, but he just thinks this guy's a crank, that he can't answer them for him, so he doesn't want anything else to do with him. And then we sort of follow on. A thing that I did notice in this scene is Dunn never touches Elijah, doesn't shake his hand, doesn't do anything like that. And he doesn't touch him at all throughout the film. So this sensory ability he has, which we learn in the next scene, he doesn't see how bad Elijah really is. And it isn't until later that they shake hands. And I thought that was really interesting, because there's certain people that he touches and he can see certain things, but he was the one person he didn't. I thought that was interesting. But it all sets up these two interesting characters, the journey they're both on, and how their lives will collide eventually in this film. With Dunn being reminded of his being injured in this crash and things like that, we see him at home, we see his son sleeps with him and thinks that it's comfortable, and we see that Dunn has a gun hidden up above, up on the shelf in the closet. Now this is something that will come back later, that we'll see in this really pivotal scene and powerful scene later in the film, but it's sort of showing he has a gun, this is where it is, and this is something that may come back later. It's another anchoring point. In this scene we learn that Dunn not only played football in high school and things like that, but he was really, really good at it and one of the best players. But after he got hurt, he ultimately stopped doing it. And I have a theory about that. There's two ways to look at it, because Audrey explains it later that they're having, she couldn't be with someone who played football like that, so he gave it up because he got injured. But I think he gave it up for two reasons. One, love, and that's what Elijah talks about later in the film as well, that he gave it up for love. But I think it was more than that. I think it was the idea that he didn't want to be put in situations where people might ask questions. He had this horrific accident, this bad accident. Audrey is hurt in some form and unconscious, and you see him rip the door off later in the film. But I think that it says so much about, he didn't want people to ask questions. He knew something was different, but he just decided to, I've been injured. Why did I survive? How was I thrown so far from the crash? And why am I still here? And he chooses love, but he also chooses to be hidden, to not talk about it, to not have anyone ask questions about how he had no scratches, which you can tell had an effect in that particular scene we saw after the train crash. The scene also looks at how, because of what happened to Dunn on the train, and he could have died, Audrey starts to ask him questions and starts to want to rekindle their relationship and their marriage and try and get their marriage back on track by starting at the beginning. And this scene is really well done. He opens the door and there she is, and she starts asking these questions. We don't see Dunn's reaction. He's just standing there. And she's just talking about these things and wanting to give things another go and all the kind of. And then it's just a powerful scene because it's very comic booky because we only see it from one point of view. And once he shuts the door, then we see his reaction. I just think that the way that scene is done is really powerful. The skill of a director to allow someone just to talk and just have it one-sided like that and know that they'll be able to capture and tell the story they wanted to tell is just a real testament to a really great filmmaker. While Dunn is at work, Elijah reappears and they have a conversation about it. Elijah's only trying to convince Dunn that he is a hero, that he has these unique gifts and he should use them to help others, and Dunn doesn't kind of believe him. Then there's a moment in this sequence where Dunn's walking along, he sees a guy, he brushes past someone in line who has a camo jacket and shirt on, and he brushes past him and he senses something's not right, and he gets his other security guard friend to start patting people down, and Elijah says, "Why did you do that?" Because I feel he's got a weapon the way he's dressed, blah, blah, blah. And if he starts to pat people down, and he does, he'll step out of line. And that's exactly what happened. But then Elijah starts to question that more. Was that just a feeling you had? Did you touch him and see something? And he said it's more of a feeling. And when people are dressed like that, Dunn says, they usually have some sort of weapon. And Elijah's like a knife, whatever. But you saw a gun, didn't you? You mentioned a gun. What did it look like? And he's like, I had this sense it was silver with a black handled grip. But it could have been anything. He may have not had nothing, or he may have had a gun in his waist. And it's sort of like, once again, Elijah's starting to get David to ask questions and starting to try and convince him. And David's in such a position that he starts to question things as well, and he starts to see Elijah could be right in certain aspects. And I think that's really interesting. Just how he follows this guy without any questions. Like I mentioned before, normal films would really go into how he would just have nothing to do with this guy. I think he's crazy, but there's more to it than that. And David can see that. From this scene, it leads into a really wonderful, there's a really great shot where they're talking and it pulls back as well, which is very comic booky. But there's a really great scene after that I really love, where Elijah's in his car, you can see it's all padded inside, it's all purple. And he gets a glimpse of this guy that left, this guy that could have had this gun. And he's so obsessed and determined to find out whether he really had the gun, to prove that Dunn is the hero he thinks he is. And he begins to follow him. And this sequence is really great because he chases after him. The guy goes down the stairs to a train station. And Elijah stops and looks down. And from that scene, you can go, that's not cool. Like, that's not great. If he falls down these stairs, he's going to break so much. And he starts to go down slowly, but then he's worried the guy's going to get on. He goes quicker and quicker, and then he falls. But the first thing that breaks is the glass cane. And I love that. It shatters everywhere. And it's a representation of what's about to happen to him. And we see the breaks, and we see him fall down the stairs. And he's right. He gets a glimpse of the guy jumping over the stalls of the train station, and he sees the gun, and he knows that he was right about Dunn. And then he continuously goes on to convince him as the film goes on. The scene after that is this sort of him testing out his strength and starting to see if he does have these particular quote-unquote abilities that Elijah keeps telling him he does. And he starts to lift weights, and his son wants to be involved, and they start lifting weights together. And then David realizes that the weights are really heavy, and he looks at them. And his son's standing away a little bit, and he realizes he's put them on. He goes, "What did you take off?" And the kid's like, "I didn't take anything off. I lied, I added." And he counts how much, and it's quite a lot. And he says to his son, "Take them off." Then his son adds more, and he can still do it. And it's this sort of really great there's two things that happen in this scene. It's a really great bonding moment between father and son. The son sees his father as a hero, like a lot of sort of young boys do with their fathers. But he sees that he's kind of extraordinary, and he's really inspired and empowered by his father being like this. And he sees his father as some sort of superhero. And two, it shows him using his abilities, or learning to use his abilities. This is something usually seen in comic book movies, but it's sort of a montage where they're learning things and doing things where they're much more simple, much more grounded, and to the purpose of showing his abilities in a simple but effective way. And it's one of my favourite sort of moments in the film, but it's also one of my favourite moments in any comic book film, in a character using his abilities. And when we see the sensory ability he has much later in the film, it has the same sort of impact. And he also sees his father as some invincible man, which will play into the scene later in the movie as well. I really like the way it's shot, where you just see him lifting the weights, and then the camera becomes part of the weights and moves with them. And each time they add more, the son moves further and further away, and in the end he's on the staircase when they've got paint cans on the end as well with all the weights. And his son ultimately does something later in the film because of this invincibility thing he thinks his father had. We return to Elijah, who's in hospital bed. The doctor's explaining breaks with ribs and a really bad break in the leg that they have to put some sort of metal rod about how bad that break is. And ultimately he has to go to physical therapy. Now, there's two things that come to mind with this scene. One is the fact that physical therapy, he ends up with Audrey. Did he ask for Audrey? Did not necessarily him being injured, but did him being injured orchestrate this ability to talk to Dunn's wife, who Dunn talked about she was the only other one in the car with him? And they start this conversation. He starts to talk about Dunn, but it's also like him explaining his theory. She thinks he's crazy, but it feels also orchestrated, this scene. Like he pursued this for a particular reason, to know answers. Whether he chose Audrey, whether it happened randomly, I don't know, but it just feels like it's been orchestrated. So much of the Elijah character in the film feels orchestrated as a character, but he feels like he's orchestrating so much, and this is a little glimpse at that. And because of Elijah being in Dunn's ear, he starts to see if this ability, sensory ability, is really something. And he starts to walk through the stadium and bump into people, and he starts to see images. And he sees one particular image in regards to a drug deal, and this character is played by M. Night himself, and we see certain things, and he can't find drugs on him. So it's this thing where it's like, at first, oh, this is something. And then when he can't find the drugs on that particular character, he starts to question, maybe it's not something. Maybe it's just me imagining things and being intuitive rather than anything else. So it's a kind of simple little scene, but it's definitely, like I said, Elijah keeps getting him to do things, and he keeps doing them randomly. He doesn't question them, he just does them. While this is happening, his son gets into a fight at school, and ultimately Dunn has to go and talk to the nurse and the teachers about what transpired. And in this scene, like, we see that his son tried to stand up for someone that he talked about, wanting to be more like his father. But also we have this really great scene with the nurse, this old nurse who's been there for so long, to the point that she knew David when he was a little kid, and she starts to tell him this story about how he almost drowned, that he sunk to the bottom of the pool because these kids were messing around and they had to save his life. This is something that Dunn starts to question. Well, if I can drown like that, I must be a normal person. All of this stuff must be just random things happening. And his son talks about how he really wanted to be him, like him. He tried to be, he thought because he was strong, he thought his son was strong. And he wasn't. And he just, I wanted to be like you. I wish I was like you as the hero. And he's like, I'm not. I'm a normal person. I nearly drowned. He starts to tell his story. But his son doesn't quite believe it. He wants to continue to believe that his father is this sort of hero figure. And because of what his father says, it leads into this scene where Audrey and David are talking. He's washing up. It's obviously after dinner. It's shot with them, like, it's shot through the kitchen window, and was just seeing them talking and conversing and talking about Elijah and how they shouldn't talk to him anymore and blah, blah. And then when Dunn moves, we see his son sitting at the table. There's something on the table. We can't quite see what it is just yet. But by David's reaction, he looks down at something and he has a surprised look. Audrey notices this and turns around, and we see that their son has the gun on the table. David's gun from the closet that we saw earlier in the film. And David's like, it's fine. He doesn't know where the bullets are. He doesn't know where I keep the bullets. And he says, in such and such. So we know the gun is loaded. It's sitting there. And these parents don't know what to do. And like, what have you got the gun for? This is when he picks it up and points it at his father. And he's like, what are you doing? And he's like, you're invincible. I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to shoot you once, and then you'll see that you are this invincible hero I think you are. He doesn't say that's kind of what he's thinking in his sort of actions. And this is this intense scene. It's wonderfully shot where he's pointing the gun at David. David's trying to talk him down. And then at one point, David decides to just lean a little bit into his son's, what he thinks is his son's delusion, and starts to say, if you shoot me, I'm going to leave. It'll bounce off me and I'm leaving and you'll never see me again. You need to put the gun down. And there's this whole thing in regards to the gun and what transpires in this particular scene with the gun, and the importance of David trying to de-escalate the situation. And then his son ultimately puts the gun down. And it's this really intense moment and they just sort of, Audrey and David just flop on the ground like, what the hell happened? What the hell's going on? And there's fear in both of them, and just luck that David was able to talk his son down. Now, apparently, from what I've been told, and I've done some research on this is something a friend of mine told me the other day, that this particular scene with the kid pointing the gun at his father was something that actually happened in real life. When George Reeves was playing Superman, well, he's really only known for playing Superman on television. He was at some sort of signing, or he was at some sort of event, and a kid appeared with a gun and pointed it at him, saying he wanted to test out his invincibility. He wanted to shoot him to see if he really was invincible. And George ultimately had to tell the kid, yeah, but you might hurt someone. The bullet will bounce off me and might hurt someone. That's how I de-escalate. But I thought this was really interesting, the connection with the Superman concept and real people, and connecting that with this particular scene. And in a lot of ways, and I agree with this film kind of, Unbreakable does kind of feel a bit like a Superman story. A character not knowing he has abilities, and then he starts to learn and work them out. Yes, Superman learned them much younger, but this is kind of that same sort of thing, and being that hero and rising up and being the hero he needs to be, even though he thinks he's not. And I just think that was kind of an interesting little tidbit that I learned. Not completely convinced, but Dunn goes to see Elijah again, and Elijah starts to tell him about the gun that he saw, that the gun that Dunn saw was real. He really did see this gun. But David doesn't believe him. David's like, no, look, I nearly drowned, blah, blah, blah. I'm not this hero you think I am, and you're wrong. And I don't want to talk to you, I don't want anything to do with you. This is where Elijah loses hope a little bit. He's now in a wheelchair because of his leg being broken because of the fall. And he's in a comic book store, which glass all around as usual, and he's being pushed along. He won't leave. He just sits there sort of catatonic in a way, and the clerk there tries to push him out, and he keeps whacking into things as they go along. And he's like, that's it, I'm calling the police. And then Elijah looks down, and on his lap is this comic book, and he turns it like he does with the comic book that he first got in the 70s around, and we see this particular character there. What this sort of is saying, that is something Elijah works out, is each hero has some sort of kryptonite, for a better word to find. Some sort of things that weaken them. And Elijah believes water is one of them. And he believes that is the thing that could hurt or kill David. It's like the answer just falls into his lap. I kind of like that. There is a small scene after this where it's Audrey and David going on their first date again. And they're playing a game about asking questions and favourite things, blah, 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 20 question type things. And then Audrey says to him, where was the point where you felt our marriage was in trouble? And he doesn't want to answer to begin with. And then he says, when I woke up for a nightmare and I didn't want to go and see you for you to tell me everything's okay. This is something that anchors back in the end of the film and sort of says so much about their relationship once again. And I think this scene is really great in the simplicity and sort of what it's saying. And beyond it being sort of David becoming a hero or learning he's a hero with these particular abilities, it's also a family drama. It's about the relationships between him and his son and him and his wife, and how everything that happens to him in this film helps his relationship with his wife, because he starts to be less sad and have something to live for and fight for, and it really helps him grow as a person, but also with his relationship. And I think that's a really cool way to do it, rather than just a normal guy and his son believes in him and he doesn't really interact with the wife aspect. And I think that encompasses so much of the skill of a filmmaker like M. Night when he writes something like this. Elijah calls him and starts to talk about these weaknesses that heroes can sometimes have. This causes Dunn to go and look at the wreckage of the train crash that's hidden in this sort of warehouse. And while he's in there, he remembers the car crash he had when he was a kid, because it relates to it. And this is the first time we see him as a young man. We see the crash. He wakes up, a few feet away from the car and doesn't know how he's not hurt or how he ended up there. He sees the car's on fire and Audrey's trapped in it. And using all his strengths, he rips the door off. He rips the door open and saves her life. And so he remembers that he did survive this car crash, like he did survive the train crash, and that it has some sort of impact on him, and that maybe Elijah isn't as crazy as he first thought he was. And there's even a guy that asks, like, is she okay? And he says to him, are you hurt? And he asks this question twice and he doesn't answer in this scene, but we know that he said yes, so he could be with Audrey, but also yes, so no one would ask any further questions about how he was able to survive. And this is where David finally decides and realizes that everything Elijah has told him, his son believing him in such a way, he starts to believe he is an actual hero, that he survived the crash for a purpose. He has a lot of strength and this sensory ability, and this is where he starts to become the hero and asks Elijah what he should do. And Elijah says, go to somewhere it's populated by a lot of people and just test it out. So he goes to this train station. Interesting, it's a train station, I've realised now, because of what happened, but I guess that's the biggest area with a lot of people. And he goes past people and he brushes past them, and he sees bad things they've done, whether they've lied, cheated, or done bad things to other people. And then he knocks into one person who we see has broken into this house and is keeping the occupants hostage, and he's kind of a weird, creepy man. This is where David decides, I need to stop this, I need to see what's going on. With his slicker on, he steps outside to begin to follow this guy, and like I said earlier, it's raining, and that's an anchoring point back to where he's watching the football team, and it's raining and he's in his slicker. He follows him back to the house, and this is ultimately where we start to, and we ultimately get to see that what this guy has done. The father's dead, and David doesn't know where the kids are or the wife, and he starts to move around the house, and we see certain things, and he gets flashes of the father, what happened to him, and he goes upstairs and sees the kids are tied up. He lets them go, and then he comes upon this room where the mother is. Now this sequence is really well shot. It's shot through curtains that flap in the wind, and we see David walk in, and he's sort of looking around at the house and bits and pieces, and then he steps outside, and as he steps outside and is looking over to see where this guy could be, we cut back to the window, and as the wind's flapping in the drapes, we see the killer, and he brushes him and pushes him, and he goes over the balcony onto the top of a pool cover. And this scene's really cool. It's in a slow motion. He's lying there, he looks up, and slowly but surely the pool cover starts to come off, and he ultimately falls in the water. And you think, oh shit, this is his weakness, this is his thing that he has to fight against. Will he survive? Will he make it? Will this be the end of him? When, because he saved the kids, they help him out of the pool with this pole, he grabs it and they save his life. And it says so much about, yes, he is this new to the scenario, being a hero. He sees the impact of the water that is sort of his weakness. And he also sees that because of this kind act, these kids help him. They saved his life, which gives him much more of a purpose and much more of, okay, I need to subdue this guy. I need to stop this bad thing from happening. So he goes back upstairs, and as the guy, it's all slow motion, is spitting. Well, it's actually really cool. He goes back upstairs. We have a shot of the woman's hands tied together with blood on them, and he's spitting stuff, beer onto her. And then then we see Dunn in the room, and he grabs him, and they have this sort of fight where Dunn holds on tight, and he gets thrown up the wall, and he gets knocked around, but he doesn't let go, and he takes all the punishment the guy throws at him, and he subdues the guy. Well, they say he kills him, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Then he goes to let the wife go, and unfortunately she's already dead. This is the moment. This is the hero moment. This is the first time he steps out into this new way of life, this new sort of abilities he has, and he puts them to the test. Like you see in a lot of comic book movies, this is where he becomes the hero. And ultimately, we don't see much more of him being the hero until we get to Glass, and we see, at the start of that film anyway, aspects of it. But it's just sort of the beginning. It's such a great journey the character goes on, from not believing to becoming that thing that everybody wants him to be, but he doesn't believe he can be or should be. And this is the moment where he rises up and says, you know what, you are all right, and I am going to pursue this being a hero thing. After he's done this act, saved these kids, and called the police anonymously, he goes home, and it's like he's a new man, or it's like he's a new man, and he picks Audrey up, takes her from the bedroom downstairs and upstairs to their bedroom. And she awakens as he puts her on the bed, and she's like, what's happening? And he said, I had a bad dream. And she's like, everything's going to be okay. So it's like, they mentioned that anchoring point earlier in the film when they went on the date about when he lost hope in them, and now it's returned. And it shows their relationship has been rekindled, that we see in the next scene when the sun comes down, they're much happier. This scene leads into probably hands down my favourite scene in the film. One of my favourite scenes besides the thing with the sun and the gun. I really love this scene. You know, that the kid comes down. It's the first time we've really seen film from his perspective. He goes down the stairs. His mother and father, Audrey and David, are talking and laughing. You can see this. They've rekindled their romance. And while they're there, the son sits down, pours himself a juice. Audrey's cooking, and it's just father and son sitting across from each other. And why his son's got the juice, David pushes the paper in front of him, and we see like a silhouette, this drawn figure, which is just him, and he saves these kids, and saves these kids. And his son looks at it, and there's tears in his eyes, and he looks up at his father, and he says, you were right. And they share this moment where the son knew this was the case and believed it so strongly, and was upset and disappointed when his father didn't, and at the fact that he doesn't know if his father really is this, and he starts to doubt it. This moment says, no, you were right. I am this person. And you and I know this, but be quiet and don't tell anybody else. And every time I see it, it brings tears to my eyes. It's such a powerful and raw scene. And it says so much with so little. And like I've been mentioning through this review, everything he talks about, everything he does in this film has an impact, there's importance to it. And it serves some sort of purpose. There's anchoring points. There's no scene or sequence that is unneeded or not useful. It all serves some sort of larger purpose, and that is why I think it's one of M. Night's best films. Maybe probably is his best film, just because of those sort of aspects, and he knew what he wanted to do with it, and he wrote such a wonderful script, and he executed it in such a tight and unique way that gave us such a powerful and wonderful film. The film ends with Dunn going to Elijah's gallery opening, and there's prints of comic book characters and drawings all around. And this is where David first meets Elijah's mother, and she starts to talk about these two figures and the hero and the villain, and something that Elijah talked about earlier in the film with another customer. And she realizes who he is. They have a conversation, and she says to him, like, this depicts this. My son always said there's two types of villains. There's the ones that use their brawn and their strength to attack the hero, and there's the other ones, the ones that use their mind to attack the hero. And that sums up exactly what Elijah did. We find out that these two are friends, and then this is the first and only time that David and Elijah shake hands, and David sees all of these bad things Elijah has done to ultimately find someone like David. Earlier in the film, he talked about a plane crash that happened. We see he was involved in it. We see there was a talk of a hotel fire, and we know he's responsible. And then we know he's responsible for the crash that killed all those people just to find David. That he really is a criminal mastermind. David lets go of his hand and starts to look around the room. And there's so many things about bomb making and plans and bits and pieces around that he finally sees who this man is, who he truly is. And he says to David, "You've found out who you are, and now I've found out who I am." And you sit there and go, this guy's a lunatic. But then you start to really think about it. Every single thing he's done throughout the movie is to get David to this point. All the questions he's asking, giving him the note on the windshield, and getting him to ask these particular questions, and getting him to do certain things. And David does this blindly without asking any questions, thinking Elijah's his friend and Elijah's there to help him become the person he's meant to be. But that's not true at all. It's all sort of selfish reasons in a lot of ways, where Elijah is really about trying to work out who he is, trying to point out and be the person, and to realize that he's not a mistake, that he serves a bigger purpose. It's just so well orchestrated, because, like, as obviously we know now, M. Night's always put some sort of twist in his films, and I know that Sixth Sense had a little bit of a twist. But I don't think anybody knew there was going to be a twist in this film, just because of the subject matter and how it was sort of handled and made. But ultimately, he did put a twist in it, and what a twist it was. It really sets up these two really unique and interesting characters, the hero, the villain, like we saw in the comic books in particular scenes throughout. And he did it all for a purpose, and it feels like he doesn't really care about David or the fact he was able to become the man he thought he could be. It's really about him. But it's an example of how to do a comic book movie right, and how to do a hero and a villain origin stories in one movie. They don't usually do that. The villain's usually established, or the hero's established, or if it's an origin story, the villain is something that just appears but we never go into depth about it. But this handles both. And I would go as far as to say this is hands down probably one of the best comic book movies ever made, in its simplicity, in its tightness. It is grounded so much in reality. There is no big superhero moments, no aliens, no big explosion, action sequences. It's just simple, to the point, and it encompasses such a wonderful story, great characters, and it is a testament to M. Night as a filmmaker. And it shows that he is a good filmmaker when he gets the right material, the right story, and he executes it in such a great way. And the use of camera in this film is fantastic. This is one of my favourite action superhero movies of all time. I think it's wonderfully done. It's a film I return to time and time again, and I draw so much out of it. And like I've mentioned in this video, I draw so much more out of it this time round. Well, that's it. That's my whole spiel and talk about Unbreakable. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you agree with some of these things, or point out things I haven't seen. I'll point out the things that this movie had impact on you, and things you noticed in your viewing of this film. Anyway, that's all from me today. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe at the bottom, follow me on Letterboxd, Facebook. Otherwise, until next time, enjoy the movies.